Hi, and welcome back to 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones. I'm Emily Tesh,
And I'm Rebecca Freymouth.
and this week we are going to be talking about the very first Chrestomanci book, Charmed Life, published in 1978. This one
Right.
I'm quite excited about because this was my first Diana Wynne Jones. I had an original 1970s very dog-eared copy, which I found in Mum's bookcase. I don't know why it was there. She was not a child when it came out. It was way too early for me. Uh, but I fell in love with that book and read it over and over again until it fell apart. So I don't have that copy anymore. It was demolished.
And I'm guessing this was actually probably quite a lot of people's first Diana Wynne Jones book, because not only is it the first Chrestomanci book, but I think it's the first book of hers to win a major award. This one won the Guardian Award.
Oh, that's true, isn't it? And I think this one was the first one to be sort of read quite widely. And it was clearly like influential both on her own work and on future children's books. Charmed Life is the story of a lonely boy who goes to live in a magical castle. That's the short
Yes.
version.
It's a lonely boy. He and his sister go to live in a magical castle. Um, it's set in kind of an alternate version of our own world that's sort of a little bit more Edwardian tinged, and a lot more magical. And there's a couple of things that she's doing in this book for the first time that I think it's going to be really fun to talk about, because we're allowed to look back. There's a lot to look back on as far as how she's looking at her previous works in this book, but she's also really breaking from the mold. For the first thing, I don't think there are any evil mothers in this book, directly at least.
No, not directly, although I think you could make a case that there is still an evil mother figure. But no, I think actually in this book the adults are possibly meant to be well intentioned. I have points, I have concerns, I have criticisms.
Constructive criticism, let's say.
In some way, it does feel like Jones is more at home writing a family that's a complete mess than one which works more or less fine.
Right. She's I think she's really trying to figure out how to do it for the first time here, maybe. She's presenting us with a good family. Because when Cat and his sister Gwendolen get to this castle, so Cat and Gwendolen are orphans. Their parents die in a tragic boating accident. We'll get back to that.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have.
We'll come back to the accident. We have theories.
Yes. And they're sort of being raised by the nice mediocre witch downstairs who's giving Gwendolen all the magic lessons that she could want, because Gwendolen is a witch. And Cat isn't. Cat is just a nice, ordinary boy. He goes to school, he has loads of friends, but he's obviously quite sad about his parents being dead in a boating accident, and so he's a bit clingy when it comes to his older sister, whom he admires very much.
Right. And then Gwendolen is the driver of this plot. In some ways, I would
100%.
argue Gwendolen is the main character of this book. Cat's just also there.
Well, that's part of the problem, right? Is that Cat spends most of the book, and I don't mean a problem for the book and that it's a bad book. I mean the problem that the book is setting out to solve structurally is that Cat spends his whole life thinking of himself as just kind of also there. He's an accessory to Gwendolen. And so
he sees himself as a minor character, a secondary character in his own life, because his life is about Gwendolen.
Right. And so when a tall, dark, handsome stranger shows up and says, well, I'm going to take you both away to my castle and teach you, and adopt you and teach you about magic, Cat assumes that he's there for Gwendolen and that he's just sort of going along because he's Gwendolen's plus one.
Right. When they arrive at the castle, Gwendolen hates everything about it and embarks on a campaign of warfare against the tall dark stranger, who is Chrestomanci, one of the most powerful enchanters in this or any other world, and all the other people who live there as well, culminating in her doing something very startling at exactly the halfway point of the book, which leaves Cat in a difficult position.
Right.
So I think this is a book in two halves, and in fact almost exactly like Power of Three, which we talked about last time. It's a book where halfway through a character is introduced which completely changes your perspective on everything.
And also should we talk about the genre?
Yes. Should we talk about the first half of the book first? Like those first 8 chapters, the Gwendolen show.
Oh my god, it is such a Gwendolen show. And you can tell that Dinah Wynne Jones is having so much fun writing all of the horrible things that Gwendolen is doing to disrupt this household.
Right. Gwendolen to me feels in some ways like a wish fulfillment power fantasy.
Uh-huh.
She is a monster. Let's get that clear up front. Like, the very first line of the book is, Cat Chant admired his elder sister Gwendolen. She was a witch. He admired her and clung to her. Great changes came about in their lives and left him no one else to cling to.
Yep.
So you start the whole book focused around this key relationship, which is Cat's admiration and clinging to his sister and his desperate loneliness. And even though it's mentioned in passing that he has dozens of friends at school, none of these relationships seem to be deep or real or meaningful once he's moved away to the castle. Gwendolen is the only person in his life who matters, which makes it really, really tragic when it becomes increasingly clear that she is evil. Like,
yes,
really
but I don't think that during the first 8 chapters we know that she's evil yet. Like, I was trying
because
to
we're
put
doing the
myself
Jones thing of being in Cat's point of view, right?
exactly. Cat loves her. And again, like going back to the previous books, when you look at these first 8 chapters, all right, Gwendolen gets to the castle and she hates it, and she hates. We've got there are 2 kids already at the castle. Crestomancy has a wife and 2 children who, again, appear to be a reasonably functional family. They
Yep.
seem to like each
Right.
other. They seem happy to be there, and Gwendolen hates all of them. And there's this sort of new step sibling thing with Gwendolen and Kat and Roger and Julia, the kids who are already there, that seems like it's going to kind of fall into the same mode as The Ogre Downstairs or even Cart and Quitter, where you have these kids who are at odds and do these kind of wacky stunts in order to get one over on each other. But there's no reason
Right.
reading the first 8 chapters to think that it's not all going to resolve in these kids becoming in cahoots with each other the way it always does.
Right. In fact, it does feel like Jones is sort of examining a central theme, a preoccupation from several angles when she comes back to this idea of this group of children who are stuck together by circumstance. And that's actually, I think it's a thing that Dinah Wynne Jones is interested in general, is the family of no choice.
Yes.
The family of this is who you're stuck with,
Yep.
which makes a lot of sense for a children's book in particular, because children generally have no choice about who they're stuck with.
Yes.
Children are stuck with whoever the adults in their lives think is appropriate for them to be with, which usually means your siblings, your classmates. This is the life you've got, whether you like it or not, and you are too young to make any decisions about any of it.
Even when it's a found family, it's a family that finds them. They don't have the opportunity to find it. It comes out and gets them, like Crestomancy comes and gets Gwendolen and Kat. And actually, she talks about how the structure of this book is sort of like a Gothic, and that, you know, Gwendolen receives this prediction that there's going to be a tall, dark stranger who gets in the way. And
Yes.
Crestomancy shows up, and he is indeed tall and dark and seems sort of sinister. And he brings them away to the castle, and there's something oppressive about the castle. And
something
you feel
strange.
Gwendolen...
Yeah, there's a strange silencing effect of the castle, and Gwendolen sort of responds to it by screaming and shouting and crying, and her voice is squashed down to like tiny squeaks. And it is almost... Okay, let's imagine this is a book where Gwendolen is the protagonist, which in my heart I do want to. Chapter 1, she receives a prophecy that... so she encounters a fortune teller who tells her that she's going to meet this tall, dark stranger who will get in her way, but if she overcomes all these disasters, she can be ruler of the world.
Yep.
And Gwendolen's like, yeah, I'd love to rule the world. And then she does everything she can to bring that about. And you know what? I enjoy a character with agency. And she has so much agency. And so much ambition.
Yes. She wants to rule the world. She's slightly hindered occasionally by the fact that Kat needs her to be his emotional support. So they get to the castle.
Right, so we've still got this figure of the parentified sibling is still like central, as has been since The Ogre Downstairs. One of the siblings has to parent the other.
Right, we are always hearing... Yeah, he's constantly clinging to her. The phrase "Cat clung to Gwendolen" shows up multiple times in the book. It's repeated. They get to the castle, and Gwendolen is ready to, you know, start planning her overthrow of the castle and her takeover. And Cat is sad and lonely, and Gwendolen says, well, you would take looking after, wouldn't you? And then she gets out her tarot cards that she uses for magic and plays a card game with him to cheer him up. And that is, I think, like, I really want that moment, I think, is really important, because I think it's one of the things that does lead you to believe, the reader. Again, I was reading this book trying to really hard to put myself in the mindset of someone who'd never read it before, and so didn't know what Gwendolen was really like. And you read these scenes where Gwendolen is ranting and raging and taking agency, and then Kat says, well, but I need you, and Gwendolen will say, sigh and say, all right, and do it. And you can read that as kind of a tsundere expression of love. I think that you're intended for the first couple chapters to read it as Kat sees it, as Gwendolen really cares about him deep down. She does, not only does she put on a good show for Kat, but she puts on a good show for everybody else. Being
From the
parentified is a weapon for her.
Yes, from the first chapter, it's clear that Gwendolen has really careful control over appearances. So there's the descriptions of Gwendolen and Kat, how they look to others. They're beautiful little orphans. They're both blonde and they look great in black. Gwendolen's very motherly to Kat when she's around other people, and everyone's very touched by it, including presumably Kat himself. This must be part of why he's so persuaded that she's, his good sister he can cling to. So Gwendolen is very aware of how she can look the part, and that will give her power. And one of the things she finds so frustrating about the castle is that the appearances are not working in her favor anymore.
No. Yeah, she's, in their little town where they're the sad, beautiful orphans. Gwendolen has been able to go to the mayor and say, I need money for this and that for me and my poor little brother. And they are the golden children. They're beautiful children. Gwendolen is gorgeous in particular, and Kat looks sad and pale and small. And that really allows them to kind of be kings and queens in this town. The whole street that they live on loves Gwendolen because of her magic power. She's the pet of the street. And then they get to the castle, and the castle seems determined to treat them like they're just ordinary kids.
Gwendolen hates this so much, and her war is really against Chrestomanci himself, who is, this tall, dark stranger, this powerful adult enchanter. From Gwendolen's point of view, this is her personal rival, and she is determined to make him acknowledge her. And one of the things that's funny about this book is that, like the way that Chrestomanci responds to Gwendolen. As a reader, you can see it's intentional. The more outrageous she is, the more vague and uninterested he gets.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, so the way that he gets very vague and refuses to notice or acknowledge, again, she's playing with what she's done before, because I was just editing our Dog's Body transcript. Mr. Duffield does this. It's because he genuinely doesn't notice. We've got the vague father in Wilkins Tooth. It's because he genuinely doesn't notice. So me reading those earlier books, I'm like, oh, obviously this vague and distant older man who seems like he doesn't care is really going to be on the ball because Chrestomanci is. But here it's reversed. This is the first time that I think she's trying to play with that expectation of the father figure who seems like he's not paying attention and doesn't know what the kids are like.
Right, and we don't find out the truth about Chrestomanci until Kat is eavesdropping on him and hears him sounding not vague at all as he calls Gwendolen that wretched child. Let's hope she doesn't try it again. So this brings me to Gwendolen's prank. So when Gwendolen feels that she is not being given due respect, due acknowledgement, she starts to cause trouble. And I was really interested by the kind of trouble she chooses to cause. So the castle it's described as like an English stately home, right? There is an old bit with a newer bit tacked on. There's an extensive formal garden. There's lots of green. There's an avenue with trees. There's an even older castle that's in ruins somewhere in the grounds. You could visit places like this.
You could visit them more easily than I can.
Yes, but then places exist. You can come and see. You can come stay with me. I'll take you to a castle. But Gwendolen attacks the castle in terms of its beauty and its sort of established image of like long-lasting power and institutional power. Like the first thing she does is she digs up the whole lawn, like that beautiful English green lawn, right? Those things take masses of maintenance and years to turn into that sort of beautiful green sweep. I remember at college being chased off the lawn by angry horses. You cannot walk on the lawn. Do you know how hard people work on this lawn? So Gwendolen, the first thing she does is she covers the whole lawn with molehills. Another time she shuts out all the light to the window, so she spoils the view in that way. She brings all the trees from all around the countryside right up against the castle doors. All of it is attacking the image of the castle, the physical like fabric of its beauty.
Right. But her best prank is the one that she does at church. Um,
Yes.
do we want to just read this bit out? Because it's really, really good, and I think iconic for a reason. So they're sitting in church, and again, I think it's important that this castle full of witches and sorcerers and everybody, they all go to church, and they're all very respectable about it. But they're sitting in church, and Gwendolen is looking demure and perfect, as she always does, and then Kat notices one of the saints in the stained glass windows yawned and put up his crosier elegantly to cover his mouth. He looked round at his neighbor, who was a formidable nun. Her robes hung in severe folds like a bundle of sticks. The bishop stretched out his stained glass crosier and tapped the nun on the shoulder. She resented it. She marched into his window and began shaking him. Kat saw her. He saw the colored, transparent bishop clouting the nun over the wimple, and the nun giving him as good as she got. Meanwhile, the hairy saint next to them made a dive for his neighbor, who was a kingly sort of saint holding a model of the castle. The kingly saint dropped his model and fled for protection in a twinkle of glassy feet behind the robes of a simpering lady saint. The hairy saint jumped gleefully up and down on the model of the castle. And on it goes.
Yeah, it ultimately culminates with like the statue on the tomb of a crusader at the back of the church, sort of drawing his enormous stone sword and sitting up. At which point, and only then, do the adults intervene and stop the whole thing. Like when it looks like it's going to turn into an actual physical threat.
Right.
But it's great. It's really funny. If you have ever been a bored child stuck in any kind of religious service and wishing it would end, you may be familiar with, I wish something would happen that was funny. And actually, Jones, in her essays, does say this is a personal wish of hers. Gwendolen makes a riot at the church service. That was pure revenge, actually, because when I was sent to boarding school, we were marched off every Sunday. We had to wear gloves and hats and coats and all this Sunday stuff. And we had to sit through all this incredibly boring church service. I spent my time grinding my teeth and hating looking at crucifixes because they always make me feel terrible, and looking instead at the stained glass windows, of which thank goodness there were many, and thinking, oh, if only they'd come alive and start running about.
Right.
So Gwendolen is like, so I meant she's a wish fulfillment power fantasy of the child who is in a boring, miserable situation where nobody is taking her seriously, going, God, I wish I could tear this whole thing down. All this adult power, institutional power, all this sort of calm and quiet that squashes the life out of Gwendolen. That she says that I feel like it's trying to crush me.
Yes.
And I think this is an experience that children have, you know. You go somewhere formal, and that doesn't just mean, like, getting taken off to a castle. It means being sent to school, having to go and sit in a classroom and sit still, which is a ridiculous thing to ask of a child.
Absolutely.
Child's wish of I wish I could just explode the whole lot and make them all run about and scream and complain. I wish I could cause chaos.
I wish I could make them respect me and let me do what I know that I can do, which is what Gwendolen wants. The real crux of her frustration is, in addition to just feeling like she's squashed in the castle, feeling like nobody's paying attention to her, she knows that she's capable of doing advanced magic, and they won't let her do it inexplicably. Question mark.
It's not that inexplicable because she very clearly is misusing magic quite badly.
Yes.
In all sorts of ways. She's a very irresponsible child. And actually, that is one thing that comes across not just in like her pranks against the castle, but it's Gwendolen gets into sort of a little petty personal war with Crestomancy's daughter, Julia. And they are very nasty to each other. And honestly, it read very real to me. If you give two 12-year-old girls the power of sorcery, this is the kind of horrible shit they would do to each other. So it's like turning each other's food into nasty stuff, turning each other's clothes into snakes. Really, like, mean, inventive, creative, but again, irresponsible things to do with all this power.
Yeah, and again, so Roger and Julia, who are Crestomancy's children, are definitely a mirror of Kat and Gwendolen. Julia is older, she's kind of bossy, she seems to be sort of in charge of that relationship to a certain extent. Roger he's placid, he's happy to go along to get along. He and Kat click pretty fast because both of them are just kind of... Yeah. They're chill. And there's this feud going on between their sisters, and meanwhile Roger is like, well, Kat, you want to come play with us? And then if Kat, who again, Kat has loads of friends, he's a very easy kid to get along with because he just says yes to whatever anyone wants to do. So when Roger says, let's hang out and play, and Gwendolen comes storming in and says, Kat, I need you for something, and then Roger and Julia say, no, Kat's with us, Kat's staying here, and Kat just sits back, he washes his hands at the argument and lets that play out, and then Gwendolen storms away again.
Mm-hmm. But the sort of irresponsible, petty misuse of magic is kind of a running theme in this book, and it's not just children who do it. So Gwendolen has come to the castle in an attempt to overthrow the castle and gain ultimate power for herself. That's not happening in a void. The world she comes from is a world of sort of petty magic users, and Jones has fun with the world building, right? There's all this sense of like an accredited witch, a professional sorcerer, a necromancer, a warlock, and it's all presented as like sort of, I don't even know how to put it, lower middle class, not very good businesses. And all these people have or share Gwendolen's resentment of the castle, because what the castle and what Chrestomanci actually does is regulate the use and misuse of magic. So on a larger scale, Gwendolen's irritation at being told what she can or can't do with magic is also the irritation of what turns out to be a kind of revolutionary movement.
Right.
To overthrow the castle. And what I find interesting about this is that if I was reading a contemporary children's book in which there is an establishment which controls magic and a revolution trying to overthrow the establishment, I know which side we'd be expected to be on.
Yeah.
But in this book, we are Team Castle. The narrative is Team Castle. It is in favour of tradition, it's in favour of establishment, it's in favour of adults who already know what they're doing, and when they tell you you're wrong, they're right and you're wrong.
But again, I do think it is intended to be sort of a bait and switch. We are intended to be on Gwendolen's side for the first half of the book. And one of the things that I also think is interesting, so I think you've made a really interesting class-based reading of this book that I think is 100% true. But when Gwendolen gets to the castle, part of her disappointment is that it's not grandeur. The people aren't, she expects to arrive and for everything to be fancy and for her to be feted and lifted among this ruling class of elites. Right. And when she gets there,
princess.
She wants to be a princess. But when she gets there, everything is very ordinary, and that's part of her disappointment. She's so appalled that Chrestomanci's wife, Millie, is just a very nice, normal, homely sort of person, and that the kids are normal kids, and that they have just plain breakfast and not elaborate spreads, and that there's, everything is kind of, she feels it as being dull and gray and squashed. But because she has, partly because she has this expectation of immediately jumping to high class, and instead what she's jumped into is bureaucracy.
Well, I will actually say, I think this is also a nuance of the English class system, that the way Gwendolen is treated when she is brought to the castle, like there is an elaborate castle front door that can be opened by a butler.
True.
Instead, Kat and Gwendolen are brought round to the side door where the housekeeper greets them. And it's pretty clear that this is meant as a kind and friendly and welcoming gesture. It's a you belong here. And this is actually, if you like, the classier way to behave. Right. Because the problem with Gwendolen's style of ambition is that she's vulgar. Yes. She wants to be a princess, but she doesn't know what that really means. She has all the appearances of a perfect little girl, but she's not actually a nice person. And although she has family connections to this aristocratic, this fancy world, Chant, the family name Gwendolen Chant, Cat Chant, is presented early on as a good name. Yes. Which is never explicitly said, but an aristocratic name, an upper class name, posh name. And Chrestomanci is a Chant. Julia and Roger are Chants. Millie is married into this family of aristocratic wizards. And it turns out that Kat's parents have been disowned from this family for reasons we'll get into. Come back to the class thing. The idea of Gwendolen as like an avatar of vulgarity, of wanting power without having any responsibility or understanding of what that means. It does read to me a little bit like an I don't know, an apologia for why class systems are actually should exist and are a good thing. Because
But
look at this
Gwendolyn,
girl who's been raised wrong. That's the head of it. She comes from a background where this pettiness is normal, and because of her vulgar, she's she's what my grandmother would call common. What a common child. But because of this behavior, she can never really belong at the castle or truly appreciate what it means or access its power. And it has this great power, and it becomes clear that there is like enormous power inherent in belonging to Crestomancy Castle.
oh, for
The
sure.
rejects completely because she would have to take on certain responsibilities and certain like behaviors, and she refuses to do that.
Right. And she also does turn around and come in and is sort of like Dave, you've made the comparison between Gwendolyn and Luke in 8 Days of Luke, which I think is right there. She's also enacting days of the week, like she's doing a crime a day, basically.
Yes, she is the spirit of amoral violence, the angry child in a horrid situation acts out.
Yes. I think for the first half of this book, I think you're right. But again, like David in 8 Days of Luke, she then turns around and takes it out on the servants. She's upset with not being high enough in the hierarchy, so she lashes out at the castle has servants who are meant to take care of them, and they are the people who immediately take against Gwendolyn the most because she's incredibly rude to them.
She is so rude. I mean, I think it's the first like really clear sign you have that Gwendolen is a nasty piece of work is the way she treats people who she thinks are beneath her.
Yes.
That's not clear until she gets to the castle where she has servants, because before that there hasn't really been anyone who is beneath her in a formal hierarchy.
And she also thinks that Roger and Julia are beneath her. She thinks that they're ordinary.
Yes, and it's all about appearances again. It's about looks, because Gwendolen is beautiful and Roger and Julia are just normal-looking kids. And Gwendolen really dwells on that and hates them for it.
Right. Gwendolen has protagonist energy, and she walks in and looks at these other kids and says, well, you have no protagonist energy. Why should I care about you? I'm waging war on Crestomancy.
And in a way, I would love to read a book where Gwendolen was the protagonist, because she is so much fun.
Everybody, even Crestomancy, is like, wow, I'm really looking forward to what she's going to do next. It's a good, it's always very fun and funny to see.
But then he brings up, what did you think of those apparitions, Kat? And this is a conversation.
Yeah, we've got to talk about the apparitions, because
right.
I think that's the first clue that this is not just an ordinary, the kids are going to be reconciled to each other, that, the kids are going to be reconciled to their new life situation.
Right, so there is a tension building through these first 8 chapters where there is something Gwendolen is doing that we don't know. But Kat, the narrator, doesn't know. And actually, I think you can tell that there's something there from the very first time we encounter early on, after their parents have died. Gwendolen and their new guardian, Mrs. Sharp, who is the witch who lives downstairs, are going through their mother's box of effects.
Mm-hmm.
And they find a matchbook with 9 matches in it, some of them burnt. And Mrs. Sharp sort of looks at this and hands it back to Gwendolen and says, I think you'd better keep that. And it becomes clear that this matchbook is the centre of some sort of magic which is not being explained and which Gwendolen has never explained to Kat.
Right.
But later on, as part of Gwendolen's pranks, she does these summonings. She makes apparitions appear, is what's called them. That's ghosts, zombies, revenants is what the adult magicians in the story say.
Yes, nobody hates them more than Kat, which I think is significant. Kat looks at them the first time.
Sees them.
Yeah, the first time one appears, he says there was a skinny white creature there. It was pressed against the dark outside of the glass, mouthing and waving. It looked like the lost ghost of a lunatic. It was weak and white and loathsome. It was draggled and slimy. Even though Kat realized almost at once that it was Gwendolen's doing, he still stared at it in horror. And then, next time he sees a full set of apparitions. Whiteness was boiling, moving, forming into a miserable bent thing with a big head. 3 more somethings were roiling and hardening beneath it. When the first thing flopped out of the flames onto the carpet, Gwendolen gave a gurgle of pleasure. Kat was amazed at how wicked she looked. Oh, don't, he said. The 3 other somethings flopped onto the carpet too, and he saw they were the apparition at the window and 3 others like it. The first was like a baby that was too small to walk, except that it was walking with its big head wobbling. The next was a cripple so twisted and cramped upon itself that it could barely hobble. The third was the apparition at the window, pitiful, wrinkled, and draggled. The last had its white skin barred with blue stripes. All were weak and white and horrible. And the word that he uses over and over again is that they're weak. They're weak and disgusting to look at, which I think is really telling, because what we eventually put together is that these apparitions are all lives of Cat. These are Cat.
They're him.
Yeah.
This is him. In fact, he's looking at himself, and I think it's probably the case that the other characters can tell it's Cat, because the Cat is revealed to be an enchanter with 9 lives, hence the nickname Cat, which Gwendolen gave to him.
Yes.
And his 9 lives give him enormous magical power because he combines in one person all the gifts of 9 different people.
The nickname Cat that Gwendolen gave to him, which is at first he thinks it's a joke, which is quite significant later on, because we learned that Gwendolen doesn't have a sense of humor. So anything that she says that's a joke is probably not really a joke.
Right. But these apparitions are Cat's deaths, and he has died several times. Even as the book starts, we discover that in other universes, we'll come to this, the child who would have been Cat died in childbirth. So that first apparition of a dying baby, that's Cat. The apparition having cramps is Cat as victim of the spell which put his 9 lives into this matchbook with 9 matches. Mm-hmm. It gave him cramps for some reason, Gwendolen tells us later. But it's the weak, draggled one I want to come back to. The one that the Cat is so horrified by when he sees it. That one drowned. In this boating accident that we have in the very first chapter that killed their parents. And the description of the accident is actually really horrifying. Cat remembered the organ playing and the paddles beating the blue sky. Clouds of steam screamed from broken pipes and drowned the screams from the crowd as every single person aboard was swept away through the weir. And that's how their parents die. And I wish to put forward the theory, this was Gwendolen. Gwendolen did this.
I think the evidence here is all circumstantial, but I think it's pretty strong circumstantial evidence to put before the court. First of all, she's got Cat's drowning life here in this procession of horrors. Second of all, the book of matches that was taken away from her by her parents.
But she doesn't get it back until after they're dead.
Yes, and as soon as they're dead, she has a plan. She's like, I would like to go live with Mrs. Sharp, who lives below, and she will teach me magic. Please, sir, this is my wish as a poor orphan. But she's got that ready.
Right. She already knows what she wants. Once her parents are dead, she immediately starts getting the magic lessons she wants. She gets the Book of the 9 Matches back. And it becomes clear that Gwendolen actually isn't a particularly good witch herself, but she is really good at using Cat's power to do what she wants. And that's what's making her so powerful and dangerous. She's exploiting someone else.
And we do know that her parents were onto her, even aside from the fact that they confiscated the matchbook, because we have this series of letters between her parents and Crestomanci. That's Crestomanci's first introduction into the book. Where the first one is a very friendly letter, sort of a condescending letter, where Crestomanci says, don't get on your high horse, I just wanted to help. And then there's a second letter that says, Dear Chant, the same to you, go to blazes. And then
whatever help Crestomanci offered, Cat's parents were very rude about it. And we're told that this letter is dated 6 years later, and in fact, we can tell it's probably from when Gwendolen was 6 years old.
Yes. This letter says, Sir, you were warned 6 years ago that something like what you related might come to pass, and you made it quite clear that you wished for no help from this quarter. We are not interested in your troubles, nor is this a charitable institution. Is it Crestomanci's fault that Gwendolen killed her parents?
I think it might be. Oh, no, let's be fair. Crestomanci contributed to the circumstances, but Gwendolen made the decision to murder her own parents.
That's true.
Because they were getting in the way of her exploiting her baby brother for magical power, in the course of which she kills her baby brother several times. Right. So she killed him when she put him in the matchbook. She killed him when he drowned. and then because he's a 9-lived enchanter, survived anyway. And this life with this apparition with the stripes on it, Gwendolen turned his violin into a cat and used an entire life to do it.
She was just so mad because his playing was so bad.
Which is another thing about the irresponsibility and the stupidity almost of Gwendolen's, like, she's enormously powerful, thanks to using Cat's power, but she does completely random and silly stuff because she's also a 12-year-old girl with no morals.
Right. She's just kind of spiteful and impulsive. Well, not necessarily impulsive. She makes very careful plans a lot of the time. But she's vengeance motivated. She wants people to notice and appreciate her, and she doesn't like when Cat does things that are outside of her plans for him as her little accessory.
Right. And then, so this episode of Gwendolen summoning these horrible apparitions and actually sending them to what turns out to be a very important dinner party for a lot of government officials.
Right, like in the ogre downstairs, again, which sort of reinforces this reading of these chapters as kind of a faux mirror of like, oh, it's kids getting into pranks and disrupting a dinner party like you do. Except for how horrified Cat is when he looks at Gwendolen's images of himself and how he sees himself.
Yes. But then finally, and we've had 8 chapters of Gwendolen just doing whatever the hell she wants and more or less getting away with it, while the adults go, but finally she faces consequences. In comes Crestomancy with his right-hand man, Michael Saunders, who's their teacher, and Gwendolen is first punished, and it's corporal punishment, so there's an ogre downstairs sort of echo. She is spanked with a boot. Kicking and screaming, and you do get the impression that she is selling it a bit, all the kicking and screaming, but it's not quite clear how nasty this punishment is. Although it is clear that the adults say they've been itching to do it for a while. Right. While she's being punished, they take away her magic. They say you can't do magic anymore. And at this point,
the book shifts. The whole book shifts.
The book flips. So, end of chapter 8, Cat goes to sleep, has a bad dream, wakes up feeling very ill, and then is fine. Goes to find his sister. And he goes in.
She's got her nightgown on back to front. That's very weird.
She's got her nightdress on back to front. And it's not Gwendolen.
It's not Gwendolen. It is Gwendolen's exact double. A girl, like in Power of Three, a girl who's come from our world, our recognizable, I mean, not ours, you and me, because we're in 2020s and she's in the 1970s, but a recognizable, ordinary British girl who's been pulled into this story and is going to look at it with reader POV eyes in a way that hasn't been done for the first 8 chapters, and her name is Janet. And do you want to talk about why she's named Janet?
Oh, I love this. Cat goes, you're not Gwendolen, he said. What a dreadful name, said the girl in the bed. I should hope not. I'm Janet Chant. So, I have obviously known this book for, God, the better part of 30 years. And it's only this year that something occurred to me. Diana Wynne Jones was an avid reader, and she says this of herself, of American science fiction. Here's what she says about it in Reflections. For a long while, another form of fantasy had been growing and flourishing outside the rules, mostly in America. It was called science fiction. The science part was because it based its fantasy on proven scientific facts, such as that Mars and Venus are habitable by humans, that galactic empires are possible, or that faster-than-light travel could happen any day now. I have been an avid reader of SF for years, and I can vouch for the degree of cross-fertilization in my case. Science fiction is full of ideas, not all of them proven and scientific, fine new ideas, and moreover the best of it is consummately well written. There you go. She's a fan. She's a fan of American science fiction. So what is going on in American science fiction in 1975 when this book was written? Well, this is the year that The Female Man by Joanna Russ was published.
Yep.
Female Man is a work of feminist science fiction, which I read for the first time this year and had a spectacular time. It
was very fortuitous that you happened to read it right when we were thinking about this.
It is a satirical piece. Russ name checks Aristophanes. It is about 4 different characters who are all the same character because they are all parallel versions of the same woman from different worlds.
Yes.
And the central figure of this book is a woman called Janet, who arrives from a strange future where there are only women and no men, into the 20th century, present day, and is then there as a tourist and observer going, this is very, very weird.
Yes.
But her name is Janet. Her name is Janet. The girl from another world appears one day and her name is Janet. And I sort of
She's coming from a feminist utopia, and the first thing that we get from our Janet is she arrives and she complains constantly about the sort of Edwardian clothes that she has to wear, the skirts and the petticoats. She says, I always wear trousers when I'm at home. To Kat,
right. Not having to sew, it says, I despise it as female bondage. Right. We have a feminist arriving from another world to say this is terrible.
And Kat looks at her. Kat looks at her and says, immediately, just like watching the way she moves, he says she just moves in a sort of scramble that was more like a boy's than a girl's, and again, quite unlike the way Gwendolen would have done it. She's throwing, if Gwendolen is sort of little girlhood, this sweet little girlhood weaponized, both, I think, the frustration against the restrictions of being asked to be a sweet little girl and using this, being a sweet little girl. Janet calls Gwendolen, very quickly starts calling her your sugar-coated sister, which I think is pretty directly, sugar and spice and everything nice. That's what little girls are made of. That's Gwendolen.
Janet knows exactly what kind of person Gwendolen is. It's really clear that Janet, without ever having met her, quickly gets her head round, all right, Gwendolen is someone who performs, she has appearances, she's sugar-coated, she can seem very sweet, and she has, don't get me wrong, Kat, I admire your sister. She thinks big. You have to admire her.
Yes. And so Janet comes in and she's not feminine. She has no interest in femininity. She doesn't want to be sugar-coated. But she and Gwendolen are the same person in a way. Kat keeps picking up on ways that Janet is like Gwendolen. I want to posit that Janet is a version of Gwendolen who's grown up in a world in, God bless, the 1970s, but far beyond the 1910s, who didn't have to be sugar-coated, who doesn't have to sort of compress herself into this sweet little shape in order to move through the world, and who doesn't have to be responsible for, who doesn't have to be parentified in the same way with regards, she doesn't have a brother, she's an only child. And when she comes through, in fact, the situation is reversed because she doesn't know anything about what life is like in Chrestomancy's world. It's a complete culture clash for her. Suddenly, Kat has to be responsible for her. He's never been responsible for anything in his life, and he's miserable about it.
Right, suddenly Kat is the one playing a role of the parent. The first thing he has to do is get her dressed. He had to put her petticoats on her, button her up the back, tie her garters, fasten her boots, and put her dress on a second time, right way round, and tie it sash for her. When he had finished, it looked all right, but Janet had an odd air of being dressed up rather than dressed. She looked at herself critically in the mirror. Thanks, you're an angel. I look rather like an Edwardian child, and I feel a wreck, Charlie.
Yeah, she's this sort of liberated spirit who needs, and like I think, to be fair to Janet, something that I think is really interesting about Janet and Kat's relationship as this goes on, first she needs him tremendously, but they have fun together. They have all these sort of bonding moments in a way that Kat, like genuine bonding moments in a way that Kat never really has with Gwendolen. They play games with each other. They run around and they frolic. And they have such a good time that it actually pulls in Roger, who comes along and is like, oh, you guys look like you're having fun. And they all start playing together. But she's also protective of him. There are a couple times later on in this book where someone comes in and threatens Kat, and Janet stands in the way in a very older sibling way and, kind of shoves him behind her, says, you're going to go through me. I want to posit that the way that Janet protects Kat is a lot more like the way Douglas and Casper protect their younger siblings than the way that Gwendolen does. she's like an older brother to him, not like an older sister.
I think you're right. And I think actually quite a lot of the ways they play together as well are sort of, it's interesting. Like the only time we see Gwendolen playing with Kat, it's something that they can do sitting quietly in her room together. But
Yes.
Janet gets out there and gets into things with him. So she does things like they go and climb a tree, and she rips her petticoats doing it, and then has to sew them up again. And then they play conkers together, which a classic of the English countryside childhood. You get some old chestnuts, you have them on a string, you hit them together, and whichever one breaks. But and I think it's Janet who, when she goes, mine's a sevener now, so it's clear that she knows this game and has played it a lot before, and she is really triumphant about winning this conquer battle.
Yeah, and I think that Gwendolen and Janet are both, in a way, Diana Wynne Jones being wish fulfillment for herself. You've got Gwendolen, who's the parentified child. We've talked a lot about Diana Wynne Jones as a parentified child, who deeply resents it and is frustrated by it and doesn't really want to be taking care of Kat, and acts out in these big, exuberant, inappropriate ways, this power fantasy.
But also weaponizes it, right?
Weaponizes it.
Being motherly is not a box she's been shut into. It's something she can exploit to get what she wants.
And is evil. Like, it becomes increasingly clear through the back half of these chapters that, Gwendolen, however you read it, cool motive, still murder. She's evil. She murdered her parents. She's very happy to try and murder Kat. She has no qualms about any of this.
She's murdered Kat multiple times.
Yes.
I mean, he does keep coming back, but it's very clear that the reason he keeps dying is because Gwendolen is fine with letting him die.
Right, and at the very end, we'll get to the very end, but, she set up another murder for Kat, and he thinks, well, she knows I'm not mad because she knows I've got 9 lives and I can afford to lose one, it's fine. And then she comes into the scene and it's like, you're gonna have to kill him multiple times because he's got 9 lives, and he's like, oh, well. But Janet, Gwendolen is sort of all the wish fulfillment aspect, I think, of weaponizing and using that motherly little girl role, and being just really deliciously evil with it. But absolutely evil. Like, you don't get, in the comparison with Luke, I think that Diana Wynne Jones can see Luke as a compelling and a potentially semi-heroic evil figure, or amoral figure, in a way that she can't with Gwendolen, because Gwendolen is also just as much the companion. She is the sweet, beautiful, feminine child who uses all of that in order to do evil, which is something that I think Diana Wynne Jones has really, really complicated feelings about. And then Janet comes in. Janet, who is the same as Gwendolen, the same person, and is not just, this sort of liberated figure of 1970s feminism, but also a writer. We learned that she writes little stories and she hides them for herself. She's a POV character who's coming into this whole world and saying, God, isn't it ridiculous? She romps around, she wears trousers, and she genuinely loves Kat. When, after the first couple of weeks of them bonding together, I think Janet finds the cat fiddle and picks him up and sort of winks at Kat and says, I love all kinds of Kat, which is really cute. And I think maybe the only time in any of these books we've read so far that one character says straight out that they love somebody else. It's Janet saying that she loves this new little brother that she's found. And it's almost like, it does feel like these are sort of 2 different ways, a split personality of Diana Wynne Jones wrestling with her feelings about being an older sister and about being a girl.
Next. Sorry, I was talking over you there because I was so excited. Divided identity. The double self.
Yeah.
That's moral. But I mean, that's also, I think, one of the things that is really interesting and satisfying to explore with the parallel universes conceit.
Yes.
Is the divided self, the multiple self, the selves who you might have been, and the self Gwendolen might have been if she weren't forced to perform the Little Mother, or if she weren't so evil. I do think is also fundamentally evil. It's not every 6-year-old girl who sets out to murder her little brother in order to exploit his magic for her own gain.
Right. I really don't think that you can read this book without understanding that Gwendolen is fundamentally just willing to kill anybody to get what she wants.
Right, and there is actually a moment where I think the moment where you see Janet really understand Gwendolen, she says, Janet looked at him consideringly. I suppose you're quite small still, she said, but you do worry me when you go all cowed. Has anyone done anything to you? I don't think so, Kat said, rather surprised. Why? Well, I never had a brother, said Janet.
Yeah.
Kat doesn't understand this exchange, but I think as a reader, you do. You see, has anyone done anything to you? Janet looks at the way Kat behaves, so you are being abused. You react
Yes.
to me like someone who has been abused, like someone who's been very badly mistreated. And in fact, Kat is so deeply sunk in his mistreatment that he doesn't recognize it for what it is. But it's true, Gwendolen mistreats him. She doesn't
Yes.
see him as a full person. She exploits him. She uses him. She doesn't love him. Um,
And you
and
pointed
in
out, I think, that the first moment of break between them is when he's finally playing with the other kids. He's managed to make friends with them. And Gwendolen comes in and says, "Oh, Kat, I need you." And he sort of allows himself to be kept by the other kids instead of going off with Gwendolen. And she says, "I don't need you now. I was going to explain to you about Mr. Nostrum's plans, and I might even have told you about mine, but I changed my mind when you just sat there and let that fat prig Julia send me away."
right. And this idea that she was going to explain Mr. Nostrum's plans, and Mr. Nostrum is he's not the main villain because the main villain is Gwendolen, but he is
Yes.
sort of the leader of this evil like group that's planning to overthrow the castle and take control of all the magic in the world for themselves so they can do more crimes with it. And to do so, they're going to have to kill Cat. So was she really going to tell Cat about his plans, or is this just another way of bullying him?
Right. Exerting power over him.
I don't think Gwendolen was ever really going to tell Cat anything.
No. I think Gwendolen was very happy to let the plans go forward, the plans which involve Mr. Nostrum and his crew slitting Cat's throat on a stone table in a beautiful garden.
Yeah, which brings us to let's talk about the garden, or
Yeah.
see it, or both.
Oh my god. So Diana Wynne Jones has this idea of the garden that she comes back to quite a lot in reflections over and over again. It's sort of part of her fundamental myth of herself, is this idea that there's a beautiful magical garden that you can, if you can just get into it, you'll understand and sort of escape from the daily grind and be in a different world that's more
Right.
beautiful.
And it's a physical place that existed, right? During her childhood, her family lived in a sort of school conference center called Clarence House, and she says it had two gardens, one ordinary and one second much bigger across a lane at the back. This other garden was kept locked. I was always begging for a key. It was like paradise, or the extension of life into the imagination. And it's clear that to Jones, this idea of the locked garden of the imagination is a sort of powerful personal image, and the need to escape into the garden of the imagination and to sort of access the fundamental enchantment that's there.
Yes. And so when Kat and Janet find their, they've sort of had this spiraling series of debacles as they're trying to protect Janet from being discovered to be Gwendolen.
Into the consequences of things Gwendolen did in the first half of the book, and it
Right.
keeps
Although
getting
sometimes they assume that it's the consequence of something Gwendolen did, and it turns out to be something that Kat's doing, because when Gwendolen's not around stealing his magic, Kat is quite a powerful sorcerer, but he has no idea. He refuses to acknowledge that. There's immediately after Kat and Gwen and Janet meet, and he's explaining the situation to her. One of the maids walks in, and they're both terrified that she's overheard, and she turns into a toad. And they're all like, "Oh no, Gwendolyn must have left a turning into a toad spell, and how are we going to get her out of this?" But it wasn't Gwendolyn. It was panicked Cat being like, "Oh no," and then just immediately turning her into a toad. He just had no idea and couldn't fathom even that he could be responsible.
right, because that comes back to that theme of responsibility and irresponsibility, I think. Because Gwendolen, we're always clear, is irresponsible with magic.
Yes.
What becomes clear through the book is that Cat is also irresponsible with magic, because it is his magic that Gwendolen is using to do all her evil crimes.
And
And
he
it
just
is
lets her do it.
He just sits back like he's got no power at all in this situation, and assumes there's nothing he can do. And because he does that, she gets away with everything over and over again.
Yes, and this is a point that I think Crestomancy and the adults in the castle are trying to push home towards in the second half of the book. There are sort of these various opportunities for Cat to explain everything that's going on, and Cat is terrified of doing it, and he's terrified of the way that he expects Crestomancy to look at him and just be like, "Oh, and you just went with her to do that? You just went along with that? You didn't say anything about it?" And because he didn't say anything about it then, he's too scared to say anything about it now, and so he just doesn't.
Right. And honestly, like, here's my criticism of the adults. I think they are mishandling this. Cat is a small child. You can't expect him to spontaneously overthrow a lifetime of abuse and go, actually, this is wrong, without
Yes.
some support. I do think that Cat is quite badly mishandled by the adults in this book.
Yes.
But it's clear that they're largely well intentioned, and if they're not handling Cat well, it's partly out of fear. If he's going along with everything Gwendolen wants and letting her do what she likes, is he the same as her?
Right.
Is he just as bad as she is? In which case, because he's such a powerful sorcerer himself, powerful enchanter, what's he going to do when confronted?
And that's a question I think Cat has for himself as well. There's a conversation that he has with Crestomancy. Crestomancy wants to give him magic lessons, and Cat is terrified because this is one of the spiraling problems that they're trying to resolve. Cat, convinced he doesn't have any magic, is like, "Oh God, they're because he's confessed to several of the things that Gwendolen has done, and they've been like, all right, well, we're going to give you magic lessons." And he's like, "Oh no, it's going to come out that I don't have magic. And then it's going to come out that Gwendolen's gone. And then it's going to come out that Janet's here. And I'm going to be in so much trouble." So he, in order to get out of all of this, he tries desperately to explain to Crestomancy that he is in fact evil. And Crestomancy is like, I think it's the fact that Cat says I'm evil that probably does more than anything else to convince Crestomancy that he isn't. Because when he asks Cat why he's so evil, and Cat says, "I steal apples, and I thought Gwendolen's tricks were funny." And Crestomancy's like, "All right, I don't think we're dealing with an evil child here."
The callback as well to the first time Crestomancy appears in the book. Cat has just been out scrumping, which is the traditional English little boy pastime of climbing apple trees and taking the apples when the farmer's not looking. So he's been scrumping. He comes back and shows Crestomancy his hat full of apples. This complete stranger he's just met, and he's very pleased with himself. And Crestomancy, in a very joyless way, goes, "Scrumping is a form of stealing." So unimpressed. "I bet you did it when you were my age." And we're told Crestomancy coughed and changed the subject.
Yep.
Which, I know we don't look forward, but if
we
you
don't look forward, but I think there's stuff in this book itself where we can see that Crestomancy is a little bit projecting his own misspent youth onto Cat and Gwendolen, and especially Cat. He's very worried about Cat finding out about his 9 lives. And in a way, he's proved right, because as soon as Cat does find out about his 9 lives, he's like, "No, I don't believe it. It's not true." And he takes one of the matches and he strikes it, and he sets himself on fire. Which is the ultimate proof for him. And it's I think in a way that's almost, as much as anything else, a moment that reframes the genre of the book, because it proves to him and it proves to us that Gwendolen has been murdering him, that he is in real peril, that none of this is just hijinks, that he's been dying over and over again, and it's awful. And it's also a very sort of gothic novel moment where Crestomancy, who's been very vague and uninterested and terrifying to Cat all the way through, comes running in, and he's disheveled, and he's like, "Oh no, you're on fire, let me take care of you." Because of course he really has cared all along.
And this is also, if you're paying attention, the moment where it's clear that Crestomancy knows very well that it's not Gwendolen, it's Janet.
Yes.
Because when Janet realizes that Cat's on fire and she can't fix it, she screams, "Crestomancy, Crestomancy, come quickly!" And he does, because he's an enchanter, and part of his magic is he comes when he's called. And they have this conversation of Cat's screaming body, where it's really clear that Janet is not talking or behaving like Gwendolen in any way.
Yes.
And you think, Crestomancy must know.
Yeah.
There's no way he doesn't know, but Kat continues to be sure that none of the adults know or understand anything that's really happening to him.
Yes, and that's also just a quick side note on Janet's power as the observer in this situation. She's got no magic at all, but she's really quick at putting together how the rules of this world work because she's observing. So she says, as soon as she gets there, Chrystomanci shows up casually when someone said his name, and she's like, "Oh, I bet because he's an enchanter, I bet he's going to keep doing that." And Kat's like, "No, it was just coincidence. Kat, you're living in Magic Castle."
Every time in the book, right? Janet, as an observer on magic, is interesting when she said, "I don't want to be a witch. The more I see of witchcraft, the more it seems just an easy way to be nasty."
Yeah.
And I think that's actually like one of the central preoccupations of the book is what would people actually do with magic? And probably mostly just be nasty.
Yes. And so to get back to the garden, the problems, the escalating problems they're dealing with at this point are Kat turned somebody into a frog by accident and her boyfriend's mad and has challenged him to a magical duel. Kat's got magic lessons starting next week and he's like, "Oh no, I can't do magic." And 3, Gwendolen bought dragon's blood from yet another one of her shady magical friends and used it for something, and now that shady magical friend wants £50 to pay for it, which they don't have. And so Kat and Janet decide that the only way to get out of this situation, once they figure out that Gwendolen went to the magic garden in order to swap worlds, because another one of Gwendolen's shady magic friends tells them there's something significant about the garden, they're like, "Well, I guess we're going to have to swap worlds and run away. It's the only way to get out of all these problems. So we've got to get to the garden."
Janet's plan as well. Janet said, "Why don't I take you back to my world and you can be my little brother back home in 1970s England?"
Yes.
And Kat thinks it sounds wonderful. And he'd be delighted to go with Janet to another world. And it's revealed that, in fact, that this is what Gwendolen has done.
Yes.
And we even get, when they're in the garden, eventually a glimpse of Gwendolen in her new world, where I am so pleased to report she has, in fact, become ruler of the world.
She did it.
She did it. Go Team Gwendolen. She set out to become the world. She succeeded. No further questions. I love it. Like, as a villain, she gets no comeuppance whatsoever.
Nope. She sees the narrative that she's in and she nopes right out of it and she just stays noped.
It's great. God forbid women do anything, right?
Including become teen queens who are
several times for power. Listen,
yes.
Listen. It's Gwendolen. She's justified because she's got the biggest protagonist energy of anyone.
She does, and it did get results. You can't say that it didn't get results. But they get to the garden, and Gwendolen's evil friends turn up and are like, "Oh, you're here. I thought we said we were going to be here in an hour," because they've been trying to avoid Gwendolen's evil friends. But it's fine. All right, we know what we need to do to liberate the magic of the entire world, and that's murder an innocent child on this stone table in this beautiful garden.
And then you're like, so Narnia.
So Narnia. They've been going this whole time. They've been going further up and further in.
Right. And so Jones gets off Narnia. Now Narnia, although it has Christian overtones, is preeminently the vivid land of the imagination. And of course, she imagines the garden, this garden of her childhood, as the land of imagination. And again in Jones's books, you come back to this mythic world, this imaginative world, which overlaps with but is not the same as the real world, and which the real world somehow needs in order to be bearable.
Yes. I think this garden definitely is the source of all the magic in this world that they're in, this sort of alternate version of England that is distinct. And, we get a couple of points of difference along the way. They're on King Charles VII instead of whatever king it would have been in the 1970s. No, Queen Elizabeth. And, Janet's constantly getting things wrong in history class because, like, the Battle of Agincourt, she's like, "Well, the English won," and they're like, "No, that's not how that one went."
Or things like Atlantis. Well, how was I supposed to know that Atlantis is what I call America?
Right. And it's all of these just like fun little glimmers of, we have no idea what the actual point of divergence of this world was, but we do know that one of the significant differences is that it has magic, and somehow a lot of this magic is wrapped up in this garden, which is also a portal to other worlds. And there's the stone table and there's a gate, And through the gate, they actually see Gwendolen in her new world in a way that I think is really quite a lot like when they look through the portals in Magician's Nephew and they see Jadis's world.
Yeah, well, I mean that they don't just look through the portal in that one; they go into Jadis as well. But right, the description of Gwendolen's new world does sort of echo the world of Charn, the world of the evil witch in The Magician's
Yes.
Nephew.
Yes.
And Gwendolen is in it as the queen, dressed up in gold and ordering people to be executed, and clearly having a wonderful time. And Kat sort of looks at her wistfully, and Janet's like, "Yeah, she seems happy."
But she comes
But
running back when the evil witches turn up and try and sacrifice Kat. And it is when, as we said before, Kat is thinking, well, I guess I'll just lose a life and it won't be so bad. And Gwendolen comes running and is like, no, you've got to kill him several more times. And he's like, oh. But he can't say anything because even though he knows that he's not, in fact, the innocent child that she thinks he is, Janet's there and Janet is. And Janet could be sacrificed in his place. And so he stays silent. And maybe I think his first genuinely unselfish act of the book is staying quiet there to protect Janet.
absolutely, and it's not Kat alone though, because while Kat is chained up on the stone table waiting to be sacrificed, they've also managed to capture Crestomancy using his one magical weakness, which is silver. They've bound him with silver chains, so he can't do magic either.
Yes.
And Crestomancy is also misdirecting as hard as he can, so that they don't realize that all they have to do is send Gwendolen away, and Janet will be back, and she can be sacrificed.
Yes, and that's the first. Even though, like, we understand, I think from probably from earlier on, but from the moment when Kat sets himself on fire, that Crestomancy does care about these kids and is trying his best, not always particularly well, to protect them. I think this is the first moment when Kat and Crestomancy understand each other at all, is both of them working together. When Crestomancy is helpless, he doesn't have the power. He's not the powerful figure in the castle. This also is very gothic. You need to see the helplessness of the dark stranger. But when they're both working together to protect Janet. Actually, I'm gonna make an argument with regards to Kat and Crestomancy that this is the gothic romance narrative of the dark handsome stranger who only has your best interests at heart. It's that sort of wish fulfillment, but it's that wish fulfillment directed towards a parent. It's it's the parental narrative of if that whole kind of fantasy of if I understood him really, then it would turn out that he loved me.
Oh God, you're right, aren't you?
Yeah,
you are. This is a fantasy about getting a good dad.
Yeah. And in order to see that he's a good dad, he needs to be helpless and powerless.
Yeah. Sort of like the ogre in the ogre downstairs, who it's only when we see his total helplessness once Sally's left that he gets drawn in with the children and is on their level.
Right. Which is a gothic narrative. That's Mr. Rochester, who, he's completely helpless once Jane has left, and then she can come back and be in a position of power with him.
And it is Kat who has to save the day, and it then is Kat who has to decide to be active for the first time in this book, really. He's the most passive imaginable protagonist.
Yes.
And it's only in the garden when he's chained up. And Gwendolen says, I've been using his magic since he was a baby. He never minds. And Kat says, I do mind, rather, from his uncomfortable slab. I am here,
Yeah.
Gwendolen looked down at him as if she was rather surprised that he was.
Yeah.
And that is actually the moment of Kat's realization that Gwendolen doesn't love him. Never has. Doesn't care. And you get Kat shut his eyes and tears ran out across both his ears. Now he knew how little Gwendolen cared about him. He was not sure he wanted any lives at all.
He's so sad.
It's a desperately sad book. In the end, this is a book, it's not a book about lonely boy finds a new family. It's lonely boy discovers he's actually even more alone than he thought.
Yes. Although he does, I don't want to write out, again, Janet, the genuine connection that Janet and Kat have, but who are both lonely children who've lost their entire family, because Janet doesn't get to go home to her parents at the end either. It's,
Gwendolen eventually, in her final act of total selfishness, goes back to the world where she's queen and seals herself in so that she can...
Right, Gwendolen picks her world, and so no one else gets to pick theirs because Gwendolyn's picked hers.
Right, and Janet is dragged back in to be her replacement in Kat's world, and it is, interestingly, the adults around Kat do say, well, we think we possibly could send you home, and Janet says, they didn't notice it wasn't me. Yeah. And there's this moment of, really painful sorrow where, you can see that Janet feels betrayed and rejected by her parents, who have failed to pick up that she was replaced by another world double.
And that
but she
again is
doesn't.
sort of, we've seen that before as kind of the ultimate, uh, you know, flash signal of bad parenting in Ogre Downstairs when Douglas notices that Malcolm isn't Malcolm and the ogre doesn't pick up on a thing. It's if your parent doesn't know you enough to know that you're not you, what kind of parent are they?
Absolutely, and you can see that Janet has this sort of hidden inner life. Like she has these little stories that she likes to hide from her parents. She knows all sorts of secrets and hiding places, and she said that's the things that she says she has in common with Gwendolen, that they keep secrets, that they hide things. And we never get the full story of what's going on between her and her family in our world. But she doesn't want to go back. She wants to stay in Kat's world with him, where she has a brother.
Yeah. And that in a way, I guess, I think it's interesting when we're talking about the sacrifice myth, because this does feel so the scene setting of the potential sacrifice of Kat or Janet feels so much like Lewis. Even, there's a quote in this book for British fantasists that says, "Damn it, I'm turning into C.S. Lewis," when she realized the parallels between the sacrifice of Aslan and the climax of Charmed Life. But unlike in Power of Three, I think there's no feeling that, like, this is not a Christian book. This is not a book that's really pulling on Christian myths. There's no sense that the sacrifice of Kat has been, that there's power in the story of the sacrifice of
Right,
Kat.
this is actually the first Jones book we've read where nobody says, "I know this story, let me explain."
No, it's
This
there.
there isn't a script. There isn't a story to explain. Cat has to figure it out for himself what he needs
Yeah,
to do next.
yeah. I think it's the fact that there isn't a script that makes this ending feel, they both feel lost. And there, you have, I don't think it's it's not as ominous an ending as in Dog's Body or 8 Days of Luke, because I do think that you can see that there's a like the Kat and Janet have built a healthy enough relationship. I think this is a book where she's trying to write about what a healthy relationship looks like, what a healthy parental relationship looks like, what a healthy sibling relationship looks like. And Kat and Janet have built a healthy sibling relationship, so there's something to move forward on. But in the moment, they've both, as the book ends, they're both they've both
They've
just
both
lost
lost
their
everything
families.
to each other. Yes, absolutely. It's to me, it was rereading it. I thought I didn't remember it was this sad.
Yeah,
I found the ending really profoundly sad.
yeah.
Uh,
And structurally, I think it's really interesting that this book opens with the death of Kat's parents. The murder potentially of Kat's parents, and with Kat just being very profoundly sad about it. We see in small ways throughout the book how sad he is, and then it distracts you. There's this sort of sleight of hand. There are these jokes. There's these hijinks. There's these various crimes, very funny crimes that Gwendolen does. But then, unlike in Power of Three, I think where the genre shift comes in, it doesn't really pull itself together. It feels unbalanced because we start and end with these tragedies. It's the loss of Kat's parents at the beginning and the loss of Kat's sister at the end. It's like, oh, this was here all along. I've managed to distract you from it for a while, but this is the book that's being told.
yeah, it's a very coherent story about loss, ultimately.
And
About loss, and I suppose about that responsibility that falls on you through
yeah,
loss.
having
You've
to
got
become
no one
your own
else
person.
left, no one else left to rely on, no one left to cling to. Cat doesn't do this by choice. He doesn't
No.
want to grow up and claim his power. He'd like to go on being Cat, who had a wonderful big sister who he admired, and loving parents who tried to stop her from doing evil magic. He doesn't get that.
Yes. Yes, he would love to not take responsibility for anything, but that is, I think, in a way, maybe unlike any of the others, this is about growing up. It's about having to take responsibility for things and understand what you're doing to other people and to the world around you.
Right, and understand when what you're doing is wrong. And that sort of comes back to sort of the wider plot, which is also a B plot, really, of this like magician's revolution, where they say, why shouldn't we use magic any way we like? Why shouldn't we be as wicked as we want? And Crestomancy, in his mildest and vaguest way, says, well, I think if you think about it, you might come up with something.
Yeah.
Uh, but this is what I mean by the bait and switch almost. This is a book where the revolution is in the wrong.
Yep.
And tradition and establishment is right, because tradition and establishment here is founded on that other garden, that garden of magic, of imagination, of enchantment and beauty.
Yes.
And what the revolution against that wants to do is destroy that in order to control it. But also, in sort of a broader sense, this is saying that there is value in what is ancient, in the foundations of things, in, if you like, in myth, in old story traditions, even in the church, annoying and boring as it is. It's clear that Gwendolen was missing the point, rather, when she does her extremely funny prank on the church. She is not understanding what the church is actually for, or what she ought to be learning from being forced to go.
Yeah, and maybe, now that you say that, I'm wondering if perhaps the reason that this book doesn't have a story that resolves it is because it's rawer than that. It's they're in the garden, which is the fount of myth itself. It's not being refracted through any specific story, unless Narnia, if you like, when we're reading it and going, it's Narnia. But it's not.
I don't think it is. I think it's the other way around. I think Narnia is drawing on the same stuff, because fundamental garden in which there is an apple tree is a considerably older myth than The Magician's Nephew, and that's kind of the point.
So true. But it is, none of the characters are looking at it and going, I know this story, because it's not a single story. It's just story. It's the power of story.
Yeah. The power of story, which lets you see into other worlds and see who you might have been, or who you still could be.
Yep, and sometimes rule them.
And sometimes rule them. God, I'm glad. I'm happy for her. I really am.
I'm so sad for Kat. All right, shall we end it there?
Let's end it there. So we are almost all the way through our season now. There are only 2 books left in the 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones for the 1970s, and they are Drowned Ammit and the Spellcoats. So 2 more Delmark
the end
books.
of the Delmark trilogy.
Yep.
All right, well, we'll see you next week, and thanks for listening.